All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Here.
Thanks everybody for joining. This is our second training session on the new EQB Climate Calculator. My name is Emily Gala. I'm a director at ICF and served as the project manager for the development of this calculator. So today I'll be providing you with an overview of the calculator with the help of a few of my colleagues who are also on the line. So this is the second of a series of trainings that we're holding. The first training covered the same content that we are covering today. So it will be repetitive for anyone who joined the prior training. We're also holding 2 additional trainings next week that will include a demo and time for Q&A. And then a recording of this session will be made available for those that weren't able to attend, or if you want to refer back to it in the future. So in terms of an agenda, today we're going to start by providing some background on the calculator. We'll then walk through key settings and features, go over inputs and outputs, and finally we'll discuss the mitigation and adaptation components, some limitations, and additional resources. So starting with some background, the climate calculator was developed to help project developers and regulatory government units assess the greenhouse gas emissions impact of potential projects in Minnesota. It also identifies mitigation and adaptation strategies and specifically can assist in answering the EAW items that relate to greenhouse gas emissions, mitigation, and adaptation. I'll note that use of the calculator to complete the EAW is not required, and that folks can continue to use other means to quantify greenhouse gas emissions. And then in terms of the scope, the calculator aims to assess the full greenhouse gas impact across both the construction and operational phases of a project. So this includes looking at both upstream and downstream impacts across 18 defined emission sources. So what does that mean exactly? As you can see in the diagram that's shown, the calculator quantifies emissions from 6 potential sources during the construction phase and 12 potential sources during the operational phase. Most of these emissions result from activities that occur on the project site. So for example, burning diesel to operate a forklift during construction, or clearing a forest to build a new stadium or residential complex. However, other activities occur upstream or downstream of a project. So this includes transportation of materials or people to the project site, emissions from the production and transport of fuel or electricity that is then consumed on site, and the transportation and treatment of waste that is generated by the project, but then treated offsite. The calculator covers key emission sources that were prioritized for inclusion based on a variety of factors, such as expected applicability across the different project types and feasibility to clearly define and quantify those emissions. So we do recognize that depending on your specific project, other emission sources could apply, and developers should not hesitate to supplement the results from the calculator with additional information. So I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Sophie, to talk through the mechanics of the calculator.
Great, thank you, Emily. Before we get started with the calculator overview, there are a few Excel settings that are needed to allow the calculator to function properly. Next slide. Great. The calculator is developed using Microsoft Excel for Microsoft 365, and automatic calculations must be selected as shown in the screenshot in the upper right. To do this, you can go to the Formulas ribbon, select the Calculation Options dropdown, and select Automatic as shown. You must also make the calculator a trusted file, as shown in the screenshot on the bottom right. To do this, before opening the file, navigate to it on your computer, right-click the file, select Properties, and mark Unblock under General. You can then reopen the file and it will be a trusted file. Lastly, macros in VBA, which stands for Visual Basic for Applications, must also be enabled for the calculator to function properly. Macros are used to automate repetitive tasks in Excel and are used here for formatting cells, copying data, and running calculations. VBA is a programming language used to write macros and is used in custom functions and automated processes throughout the calculator. The next slide will show a recording of how to enable these settings. So to enable macros in VBA, open any Excel file, such as the blank file shown here. Select File, Options, Trust Center Settings, Macro Settings, and you'll make the selections as shown in the video. This includes selecting Disable VBA with Notification, Enable Macros when VBA is enabled, and Trust Access. You can now close out of the Excel file you had opened and open the calculator. You'll then select Enable Content from the top ribbon of the calculator and select Yes. And now macros will be enabled and the file is trusted and ready to go. This setup allows all calculator functionality to work without compromising other Excel files users use. And it will also be included in the user's guide. Next slide. Great. Now we'll review the calculator structure, navigation functionality, formatting, data validation, and overall process of the calculator. The calculator is separated into the introduction and user guide, shown in dark blue tabs, the background information, user inputs and notes in yellow tabs, calculations and results in green tabs, mitigation measures and adaptation strategies in blue, and the assumptions and constants used throughout the calculator in gray tabs. There are also white tabs at the end of the calculator that document all raw data inputs by emission source for the calculations and assumptions. The structure of the calculator is designed to guide users through the necessary inputs for each emission source identified as applicable to the project, the calculations for the emissions estimates across the construction and operation phases, and the results. Today, we'll be focusing on the tabs up through adaptation in blue. Next slide. Great. Navigating the calculator is straightforward. Users can either use the navigation arrow buttons at the top of each tab, or they may select the tabs themselves at the bottom to move throughout the sections. The green boxes at the top of the user inputs, construction, and operation tabs allow for quick access to specific emission source sections within each tab, and return to top buttons at the bottom help users easily return to the beginning of a tab. The screenshot here shows an example of these navigation buttons on the User Inputs tab, as well as the tab structure at the bottom. Next slide. Formatting throughout the calculator is incorporated to help guide users through the sections that require their inputs and to identify if any steps have been missed. As shown in the legend screenshot at the bottom, different cell color shading indicates different functions and helps users quickly identify where to enter data and what information is available. Yellow cells are for user inputs, while blue, white, green, light green, gray, and black cells are not editable, but each represent different criteria. On the user inputs and project background tabs, icons indicate if an input is needed and if it has been input correctly, as shown by the gray circle icon in the screenshot. On the User Inputs tab, users may also hide all rows not applicable by selecting the Hide Sources Not Applicable button, as shown in the screenshot. All sources can be shown by selecting the Show All Sources button on the User Inputs tab. Next slide. There are also several built-in data validations that ensure that user inputs meet specific criteria, such as value ranges and formatting restrictions. Pop-up messages are built in if non-valid values are input or if inputs are missing on relevant tabs, as shown in the example screenshot in the upper right, for a field that must be a non-negative value. As I mentioned before, Checker icons provide visual feedback on the status of each field, helping users identify any missing or incorrect data inputs. A gray circle will be displayed if the emission source is excluded and no inputs are needed. A red X icon will display if the input is needed but has not been populated or has not been populated correctly. This is shown in the screenshot at the bottom, where there is an emission source that has been selected as applicable to the project, but the inputs are not correct. They must sum to 100% in this instance. Lastly, a green check icon will display if the input is needed and it has been populated correctly. These checker icons are displayed by all necessary input fields on the project background and user input tabs. Where necessary, red text will also display if inputs are not added correctly, as shown in the screenshot for the percent of waste treatment practices at the bottom of this slide. Next slide. Great. Default assumptions are available for certain user inputs and are displayed in gray cells as shown in the last column of the table in this screenshot. Users can easily apply these defaults to streamline their data entry process by selecting the Apply Defaults button to the right of these tables. A reset button is also included to clear those values, allowing for easier data entry. Users may also reset all inputs for all emission sources at the top of the User Inputs tab by using the Reset All Inputs button. This screenshot also shows an example of the red X icon I mentioned before, appearing here because the emission source was selected as applicable to the project, but no inputs have been added by the user. Therefore, it is incomplete. Next slide. Great. The diagram here outlines the steps users should follow when using the calculator, beginning with filling out project background information and selecting applicable emission sources, followed by entering data for emission sources designated as applicable to the project, documenting any assumptions and notes, and reviewing the calculations and results. Users may then select relevant mitigation measures and adaptation strategies that are applicable to their project, along with selecting any relevant climate trends and project characteristics, which will narrow the list of relevant adaptation strategies. Users may also generate a PDF summary report of all inputs and results, a PDF of selected mitigation measures, and a PDF of selected adaptation strategies. Buttons are provided for each of these throughout the calculator to generate these PDFs. The calculator guides users through each of these steps, and each tab is labeled accordingly. The steps are also outlined at the very beginning of the calculator. I'll pass it on to Katie now to dive into the user inputs.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm Katie O'Malley. And now that we've seen how to use the tool, how to navigate, we'll jump in with user inputs. So next slide, please. Great. So the project information is entered on the project background tab, which is noted in the calculator as step 1. So back to the diagram from the previous slide, step 1 is where we're getting started here, showing exactly how to fill out the calculator. So when you're using it, you'll enter information into the yellow cells indicated here. Many of these inputs are required to calculate results. And for instance, the construction duration ends up being multiplied by hours per day that the construction equipment is used, and that ends up calculating fuel consumption of equipment in construction. So these cells are needed, as indicated by the X's, to be populated at this stage. The project area by building type is another example here. That's used to inform things like building energy consumption and the assumptions throughout the calculator that are categorized by different building types. The operational year is used to inform some of the annually variable assumptions in the calculator as well. Some of this project background and project information is already included in the EAW, and certain cells include some specific formatting requirements. Those are indicated in the pop-up information you can see here on the screen for one example, where information is required to be entered as a date. And if all else fails, since there are a lot of data cells here that we're not getting into detail, the user guide contains additional guidance for filling out the tab and how each of these fields ends up getting used across the calculator. Next slide, please. So users have the option to specify their preferred units for emissions reporting in the Results tab. The flexibility here allows for the presentation of data in tons, metric tons, or kilograms, which can cater to different user preferences and enhance the calculator's usability. While we were developing the calculator, we heard of a few different preferences and decided to make this cell able to toggle between unit types. This way, project developers can use the units that are most intuitive to them. And similarly, unit selection might be useful to accommodate projects of different sizes. It might make more sense, for instance, for large-scale projects to show emissions in tons or metric tons, but those units might be challenging or not as useful for some smaller projects where emissions may need to see multiple decimal places and use a different unit type here. Next slide. Another key part of the calculator is the selection of which greenhouse gas emission sources are applicable to your project type. Many of you may not know exactly if something like HFC leakage would necessarily be applicable to your project type, so we've added a column that indicates the default selection for your primary, or based on your primary and secondary project categories that you selected above in the first part of the project information section. Users can apply default values or select individual sources using drop-down menus in this table. You do need to make a selection for each emission source, as this will impact the overall emissions assessment, and you can change these later if needed. Essentially, anything that ends up being listed as a no in these drop-downs within this table will be selected or will be shaded out across the rest of the calculator. Next slide, please. So after populating the project information, we navigate to the next tab, and that's step 2. So the user inputs tab is the second step, and that's where, again, the user input cells are shaded in yellow, and anything that's not an emission source for your project is grayed out, as I mentioned on the last slide. So throughout this tab, there are specific sections for each emission source, and in many cases, there are buttons to apply default data that are shown in the gray cells across each table. Each table also has an icon beside it to indicate whether or not all of the inputs have been correctly added to the table. There are some buttons to help navigate and a general reset button for the entire tab as well. And because there are a number of emission sources and specific inputs, the user guide, again, is a great place to go for specific questions. And finally, I'll mention that in some cases, you might not have the exact data available to you. For instance, the number of employees that are commuting to a construction site for the project, but your best judgment is sufficient for filling out the calculator here. Next slide. So after entering in your user inputs, selecting default data or entering your own, the Notes tab is an optional area to provide space for documenting assumptions, data sources, any special notes or circumstances related to the project. This information can be helpful for other reviewers and is included when you can generate a summary report, which we'll get into in a bit. Once you've finished populating step 3 and entering in project information and inputs, you can then navigate to the next tab to see the construction emission results. So next slide, please. We'll now discuss the outputs of the calculator, how to visualize and understand what the calculator is outputting for you. So the construction and operations tabs show the interim calculations of emissions, which are based on the user inputs, the tool assumptions, and this just shows you the calculation, your inputs, your outputs, and all assumptions here. The fields are not editable, so it ensures that the data and calculations are getting pulled in and emissions are getting calculated correctly. Users can select the headers for each emission source across the table in this tab and see additional information about the data sources. You can also select the green buttons to navigate across the tab as well. and results here are presented in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent for clarity. The results are shown in aggregate for construction and per year for operations, with the exception of operational land use. Next slide, please. So you can navigate to the construction tab, to the operations tab, to see each emission source and their line-by-line sets of calculations. But the results tab shows everything aggregated in a summary format. So you can see here the annualized and cumulative emissions for your project. The cumulative emissions represent total emissions, and that's both from construction and operational phases over the project's lifespan. The annualized emissions, on the other hand, provide a yearly average, and that is calculated by dividing the cumulative emissions by the lifetime. The lifetime is estimated based on the project information data that a user enters in step 1, and that's where we enter the start and end dates of construction, the operation year, and the lifetime of the project. Again, there's some annually variable assumptions as well, and so those results are summarized on the results tab. Next slide, please. Another feature of the results tab is the section at the bottom on emissions equivalencies. This is an extraction of a tool that's on the US EPA's website, and this translates greenhouse gas emissions to their standard units to metrics that might make some more sense to the average person. And these hopefully provide additional context for cumulative and annualized emissions and can help project developers understand the broader impact of their projects. So you can see here the cumulative emissions section, and those 3 options here show emissions from the miles driven of average gasoline vehicles, gallons of gasoline consumed, or tons of waste recycled instead of landfilled. On the other hand, you also see the annualized emissions, and those are annual emissions equivalencies. So gas power vehicles per year, home energy use per year, acres of forest per year. Next slide, please. So the charts tab is another area where results are summarized from the calculator. The charts tab visually represents the emissions data, and the lifetime emissions are shown here as a stacked bar chart, and emissions by project phase are shown as clustered column charts. The graphical representation here helps to understand quickly the emissions profile of projects, and non-applicable sources are automatically hidden for clarity. Next slide, please. The summary report that I alluded to earlier when we discussed the Notes tab includes comprehensive summary information from the calculator, such as the background details, the cumulative and annualized emissions by source, the user inputs, the notes, charts, and users can generate this report by selecting the appropriate option on the Results tab. And note, this is not a mandatory step at all. It's just a helpful extraction or export of your data, but it's not required for completing the EAW. I'll now pass back to Emily to wrap up with the final couple of sections of the calculator.
Thanks, Katie. So while the calculator does focus on quantifying greenhouse gas emissions, it also includes 2 additional modules to help developers identify mitigation measures and adaptation strategies. So in the mitigation module, you'll find 146 potential mitigation measures. Each measure is categorized by the main source from which emission reductions are expected. You can use the filters to tailor the list of measures based on the emission source, and then review and select the measures you intend to implement using either the drop-down or the Select All button. Once you've selected your measures, the rows will highlight in gray, as you can see in the image on the slide. You can then generate a PDF that will save a file that includes all the measures that are shown. Next slide. So the adaptation module works similarly to the mitigation module in that it provides 54 potential adaptation strategies. However, unlike the mitigation measures that are characterized by emission source, the adaptation strategies are categorized by climate trend and project characteristic. And so each strategy may map to more than one climate trend and project characteristic. And so to narrow the list of strategies in this module, you'll use the checkboxes that will automatically filter the list. And so once filtered, you can then use the drop-down to select the strategies that you want to implement, or you can click the select all button and all of the strategies will change to yes. So as with the mitigation measures, selected strategies will highlight in gray, and then you can export that list into a PDF by selecting the Generate PDF button. So before we wrap up, we do want to note a few limitations of the calculator. So first, as I noted earlier, there are emission sources that may be applicable to your project that are not quantified in the calculator. If this is the case for your project, you are encouraged to separately assess the emissions impact of those sources. Next, we do want to acknowledge that there are already quantification tools available for both highway projects and feedlots. So for highway projects, developers should continue to use the MICE tool to evaluate their impact. For feedlots, the quantification methods applied in this calculator generally align with the existing feedlot tool. However, there are a few notable differences. So specifically, this calculator quantifies emissions from manure on pasture and indirect nitrous oxide emissions. It also allows users to specify the portion of manure applied to land as fertilizer. In contrast, the feedlot calculator does not quantify indirect emissions or emissions from manure on pasture, and it also assumes by default that 100% of manure is applied to fertilizer as fertilizer. In addition, this calculator does not quantify avoided emissions from alfalfa, and it quantifies lifetime emissions rather than emissions from only a single calendar year. We also want to note that since the calculator includes upstream and downstream impacts, it is possible to double count emissions depending on your project and the emission sources you quantify in the calculator. So for example, the default emission factors for industrial processes generally include emissions from energy consumed by the facility. Therefore, emissions quantified by this source could overlap with emissions from building energy consumption, depending on your project and the building energy intensity assumptions that are applied. Therefore, it's important when applying defaults to ensure you understand what they include. And this information is documented in detail within the report and the user guide that will accompany the calculator. In terms of scope, emission offsets, which refer to emissions that are avoided as a result of project activities, are not included. So if your project generates biogas, for example, which is then sold and used by another facility to displace the consumption of natural gas, those avoided emissions are not currently quantified by the calculator. Similarly, mitigation measures are generally not quantified. So there are some cases where reductions are quantified, such as for projects that use on-site renewables. But for the most part, the calculator is not currently designed to directly quantify reductions from mitigation measures. So some of these limitations are the result of intentional decisions regarding the scope of the calculator. Others are the result of resource constraints and may be addressed in the future. Lastly, I want to ensure you are aware of available resources and other upcoming training opportunities. In terms of resources, the calculator is set to be officially released on July 1st. You can, however, access the calculator now by visiting EQB's engagement website. There you will also find a copy of the fact sheet that is shown here on the slide, which provides additional context and background on the calculator, as well as answers to frequently asked questions. And then a report that documents the calculator, including the detailed methodologies and all of the assumptions we use in there, as well as a user guide, will also be made available soon. And then finally, I've included here the EAW process website, where you can find existing resources. And I believe this is where the final calculator will be posted. So as I noted before, there are 2 additional trainings that are being held next week. So these trainings will be different from the one being held today and the one we previously held. They will include a demonstration of the calculator, and we'll have a large chunk of time for Q&A as well. So details of those trainings are posted on EQB's website. We really encourage everybody to go to the website, download the calculator, and look through it prior to the trainings next week, and then use those to come with any questions you have. You're also welcome to put questions in the chat now if you have them. We do have some time. We can try to answer questions now, or we can also make sure that we cover those proactively next week. And then finally, on the slide before you, we included Steph's contact information. Steph is the main contact at EQB for this calculator and will be someone you can continue to reach out to with questions after we've wrapped up these training sessions. All right, well, that completes our training. And yes, as I mentioned, we will make sure that the webinar and we can work with Steph as well to get a copy of the slides either posted or distributed so you can have access to them.